Hi, SAS listeners. Welcome back to another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Long Valley Studio in Washington, Utah. This is episode 164, and today's guest is someone whose impact stretches far beyond titles or tenure. For more than 4 decades, Rita Smith has stood on the front lines of our nation's fight to end violence against women, building systems where none existed, challenging institutions to do better, and lifting survivors' voices long before the world was willing to listen. Rita's resume reads like a masterclass in advocacy. Senior advisor to the NFL on domestic violence and sexual assault, VP of International Relations for DomesticShelters.org, consultant to countless national organizations, and a longtime board member working with victims of sex trafficking. Her leadership has shaped policy, empowered programs, and elevated survivor voices across the country. But at her core, Rita is still that grassroots organizer who believes survivors deserve compassion, believability, and justice. In today's conversation, she brings not just experience, but heart, challenging all of us to rethink how systems respond to violence and reminding us what it means to build a world where every survivor is truly seen, heard, and safe. This is a fascinating conversation. Let's get into it. Here's Rita. Rita, I truly appreciate your willingness to be here.
I'm happy to be here. I'm excited about sharing information that might be helpful to your listeners.
Well, thanks. Rita, I'm going to start off, if I could, with just a real simple request to have you tell us about yourself, your educational background, your professional background, and then what it is that you are currently working on or doing to help victims and survivors of rape or sexual assault or any interpersonal violence for that matter.
Well, I got my bachelor's degree in psychology and had developed a fairly extensive vision of what I was going to do over the course of my career. Was really pretty committed to that, Dave, and that became a reality for about a year and a half. So I had planned on working with emotionally disturbed kids, and I had a whole strategy around getting my master's and my doctorate and things like that. And for about a year and a half, I worked with a residential facility that also had an on-site school for kids. I found it fascinating, and at that point was looking for another job. And this was in 1981, and saw an ad in the newspaper because that's how we found jobs in 1981.
Yep.
And it was for a counselor. And so, I'm one of those. So I sent my resume in, got called for an interview. I got to the location and got into the interview with several women. And they asked me what I knew about battered women. And I have to tell you, Dave, I knew nothing. Zero. I had my bachelor's degree in psychology, but it was not information that I had ever given. And unfortunately, still today, people get very little information about family violence still in colleges. And so
true.
So what I feel like is I bluffed my way through that interview. They did a second interview. I kind of got myself through that one and got hired as a weekend crisis counselor in a shelter in Colorado and started a journey of enormous education and learning and skill development that started me on a path for a career that I had no idea I was going to do. I mean, it was very, very new in this work still. Not everybody had shelters at that point in time. And so I think that first 2 to 3 years when I was working in that shelter, I think what came to me was that it started to be an aha moment for me. Like, no wonder the kids aren't doing okay. If they're not safe at home, of course the kids were not going to be okay. Of course the kids were going to have trouble dealing if they weren't safe at home. The goal to protect kids meant we had to protect the parent at risk. And so I started on a different path to the same goal I had envisioned for myself, which is to help kids become thriving and fully functioning adults. And I took on different jobs, moved through the work in a different variety of ways. I was a program director at one point, and then for over 20 years, I was director of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So that was kind of my career path directly within working with domestic violence and sexual assault victims.
It's kind of interesting because when you said that you found this job through a newspaper ad, that's how I became a cop. I was actually roofing and couldn't stand what I was doing. And living in the same area as you probably remember Boulder's newspaper was the Daily Camera. And That's how I found my job. So And that's a kind of another connection that I have with you. It's one of the reasons that when I read about you and your position with the national program, I wanted to have you talk about those experiences, because just in that brief intro that you just gave, there's so much about what you've done and what you are doing that makes you what I would call a perfect guest. Can you tell us about that experience, those 20 years as the national director, and what it was like to develop that early on education about what the dynamics of domestic violence and abuse are, and how that does impact children?
Well, Dave, I think it was always clear to me that the people who could help us understand the impact are survivors and victims. That you don't learn that in some respects any better than if you sit and just listen to people who've experienced the violence themselves. People who've been sexually assaulted or a victim of domestic violence can tell you what that's like and can tell you what's helpful to them to get free. And the kids themselves can share with you what the impact is. For me, the education I got wasn't with the bachelor's degree I had so much as with just sitting and listening to hundreds, if not thousands, of mostly women over the years doing this work, both in shelter, on crisis line, and then as the director of a national organization that mostly worked towards supporting services throughout the United States. So I got just this broad PhD level education, and the survivors themselves are who taught me, and I am forever grateful to them for trusting me with their vulnerability and trusting me with the worst thing that ever happened to them in their life, because not everybody responds well to those stories. I'm grateful that they taught me and that they trusted me so that I could help them move this issue forward in a way that we respond to it better.
Again, I can so relate to that, because my level of education in domestic violence was zero, basically, until I became a police officer. It was so eye-opening and so important to be a good listener and learn some of those trauma-informed approaches even before the term trauma-informed existed.
Right.
And I think that's critical. What you've touched on right there is so important in terms of being a good listener, because it is so educational, but it also is so supportive. Most victims and survivors of DV and sexual assault aren't listened to.
Right.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, not just not listened to, but not believed, challenged, questioned. People reframe what they've just said to them in ways that isn't accurate. And so I think that that was really an important part of my advocate learning and my advocate skill advancement, was to really understand from their perspective, not mine, but from their perspective, what was happening to them. Because it's not helpful for me to say in my head even, well, I wouldn't have done that, or I wouldn't have responded that way. It's like, it's not about me. It's about what the impact was on this person and what are they looking for in terms of help. I could develop all kinds of strategy or ideas myself around what I think would be best for them. But that's not what a good advocate does. What a good advocate does is they listen, they start to parse out the different ways that they're finding resistance to their efforts to get free, whether it's stalking or manipulation or love bombing or whatever it is that the abuser is trying to do to keep them from succeeding. There are strategies that I have in my toolbox as an advocate that could help them get over some of those obstacles. So it's really just listening to what is stopping them or preventing them or keeping them from getting what they need. And then looking in the toolbox that I have and say, well, here are the things I have. Are any of these things going to be helpful to you? Which ones do you want to look at? Which ones do you explore? Instead of me just saying, well, I think you ought to, and this is where you should go, and this is who you should talk to. I think that's the least helpful thing we can do, because they've been told what to do. They've been told how ineffective they are. They're a bad parent. You've got all kinds of bad messages in their head. I don't need to be adding to that as I'm trying to help.
Wow. That is such a great perspective on what it is that victims need versus what it is that most people in the advocacy and law enforcement and even prosecution realm had been doing back in those early days. I really think that the awareness of the impact of domestic violence and interpersonal violence, rape, sexual assault started in the late 70s and early 80s. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, the first shelter in this country opened in 1976.
Yeah. And so for me, as a brand new detective in 1983, I wish I'd known you.
Me too. I wish I'd known you were there, Dave, because we didn't have great experiences with law enforcement at that point in time.
Exactly. And I hate disparaging anyone. I just know that overall, in the three areas that I just mentioned, there's still a lot of learning that needs to occur with law enforcement, advocacy, and prosecution. It's even interesting, I think, that I've heard so many negatively impactful stories about victim advocates even not having the proper education or care concerns for victims and survivors. And even some advocates have caused additional harm to survivors. I attribute that to just that lack of education. Tell me more, if you could, about your own personal experience with learning about this, because I relied on publications that were coming out of the Minnesota Project. I can't remember what it was called.
Duluth Project, right?
Yes, the Duluth Project, as well as the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which was doing phenomenal work and had a national reputation.
Right.
Was that part of your learning also? If so, tell us about that, and then anything else that helped you along that path of gaining the experience and compassion and empathy needed to handle these types of cases.
Well, it was very different, Dave, when I first started. We were a very new movement. For better or worse, we were making it up as we went along because the reality is there wasn't a framework. This hadn't occurred before. There weren't resources. There weren't services. And so we were kind of making it up as we went along. And we were very, very connected to each other, working in coalition in a very strong and cohesive way for the first probably 15 years of this work that I did. Very strong. The National Coalition, the Colorado Coalition. I mean, I was really involved when I was working in shelter with the Colorado Coalition, the state coalition. We met a lot over the course of time as advocates. We talked a lot. We shared information. We shared strategies. We did legislative work together. I mean, it was really a very cohesive process. And it was also very diverse. There were many, many women of color who were part of the whole early organizing strategy. And so we had the understanding of how it is that violence and oppression are connected. And so we worked toward ending those kind of oppressions because that's what created and fed violence. And I'm not sure that this kind of collective organizing, thinking, strategically working together still occurs as much as it did when I first started. I found it incredibly valuable to sit with other advocates who had done work and who were trying to develop strategies in their communities. And so there were rural women and working with immigrant population. And so I learned so much about so many different facets of the work at that point in time. And I just don't think it's as collective as it is anymore. We're still really connected, especially nationally, on the legislative process. We're pretty good at that. But that's about it. I don't see the same kind of organizing and strategizing that we did in those early days, connecting all of the programs together, having conversations on a regular basis, really working together in concert. So I'm not sure how that's affected the work because I have been now doing it very differently over the last 10 years. But when I was there, it was really critical for me to have connection and contact on a regular basis with advocates to really think through, is this in the best interest of the people we're serving? Do we really need to have shelter rules that throw people out the door because they haven't cleaned today? Or we just had really tough conversations with each other. And I think it was a process that was very helpful to people who sought our services.
I'm going to concur with you on 100% of that. Not only from my perspective as a detective, but also what I dealt with from the prosecution end of things, as well as the public knowledge and pushback. It was really hard to convince the general public that domestic violence was a horrific impact on not only women and children and sometimes men, but also in the workplace and in interpersonal relationships outside of the relationship they were in. Family relationships and things like that, where the general public was saying, you know what, advocates, law enforcement, prosecutors, stay out of this. This is none of your business. What happens in somebody's home in their four walls is their business, not yours.
Right.
And man, that seemed to really slow things down tremendously because the public didn't understand what was going on either. But there were some great coalitions, I remember, in Colorado. Let's compare notes. Did you know Ann Munch with Ending Violence Against Women?
Ann was, and still is, does really great work. I didn't work directly with her because I was focused on the national scene. When I started with the National Coalition, my focus became broader. And so I actually was more connected to people outside Colorado than I had been previously. So I felt very lost at some point because I was traveling so much, and we did a conference every 2 years. And so I knew people from South Carolina, I knew people from Florida. I spent a lot of time with them because on our board of the National Coalition, we had people from all over the country. 50% were survivors. And so we had people from all over the country that I spent a lot of time with. But I didn't spend as much time in Colorado connected to the programs here or the other state coalition. And I missed that because we had always been a very, very strong and connected community here, and we're doing great work. But there are people doing that all over the country, I found.
Yeah. Rita, tell me more, if you could, about that role you had as the national director and what you were trying to accomplish nationally.
The National Coalition started very early in this work. In 1978, when Jimmy Carter was president, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights hosted a hearing in Washington, D.C. on this new emerging issue called battered wives. And so about 200 advocates from all over the country got themselves to D.C. And back in 1978, most of them were driving cross country because there was so little money in this work at that point in time. But they got there. They got to D.C., and about 200 people were advocates from the country were testifying about what this thing was that was happening in communities across America. And if you've ever been in a congressional hearing or meeting, you know that you have a limited amount of time. And so in between different speakers, the women would gather in the women's restroom to say, now we got to talk about this and we got to talk about, and they were just rowdy women. They were just rowdy. And there were very few women's restrooms in Congress in 1978, mind you. And so they were being so disruptive that the Capitol Police threatened to throw them out a number of times.
Wow.
And the Civil Rights Commission, who had organized the hearing, finally found one of those committee meeting rooms that wasn't being used. I wasn't there at the time, but this is a story that several of the founding mothers of the National Coalition shared with me, is that they got into this meeting room so they could actually have a conversation with each other in between the speakers and really make sure they hit all the points they needed to hit. I had this vision of these women because they were standing on the toilets and standing in the sinks, and they were just being it was important that they get their message across.
Yeah.
They were passionate women. And I love that that's how this kind of national organizing movement started, was these women who just wouldn't be demure in the way that they asked for what they needed. And Congress got the message. And the National Coalition, those women, those 200 advocates, basically, before they left D.C., said, look, most of us were in crisis. We don't have time to be doing this work nationally. Somebody's got to be here educating these people. Every state has to have their own group to be educating their legislatures. So in September of that year, 1978, the National Coalition was formed. Advocates from all over the country started sending representatives to organize nationally, and state coalitions started to develop from that energy. And then anywhere there was a need for a shelter or a program, they would then contact the National Coalition, and then we would help them try to figure out, how do they start a program? Did they have a state coalition? If they did have a state coalition, who else is doing that work in their state so that they could start? So it became this incubation point for people to develop services all over the country, because there were so few in 1978. The National Coalition kind of became the springboard for this massive network that now exists, with state coalition in every state and all U.S. territories, and over 3,000 programs throughout the United States. And that started with that meeting out of Washington where women just would not be silenced.
I'm fascinated by that story. I love hearing it. So thank you for sharing that, because that is so important that all of that occurred. Just listening to you telling that story and hearing the passion in your voice brings back so much of my personal experience in my memories of learning what I was learning and wanting to be a part of a good force from a law enforcement perspective. Rita, could you tell us then about how you started getting more involved and then how you became the director?
Because I had been really committed to this work, I mean, it grabbed me, David, really. It just, I think this is where I'm supposed to be.
Yeah.
And so I look for opportunities to grow, opportunities to take on more responsibility. And like I said, I became a director of a local program and was on the board of the Colorado Coalition for a number of years. And so I found myself understanding that we can't just provide services. What we're trying to do is stop violence and change the culture. And that's a different set of work than making sure somebody's safe and has a 24-hour crisis line to access. Those are two parallel paths that we worked on. And so I found myself drifting more and more towards the organizing, changing law, working to educate people who have influence, like corporations and foundations. So after about 9.5 years or so, directly working in shelter, I found myself moving towards a more administrative role. The National Coalition had been based in Washington, D.C. for a very long time. And then in 1992, everything but the policy work got moved out of D.C. and the program services and membership and all of that moved to Denver. Denver was picked as the headquarters. And so when it came here in 1992, there was a job opening. And I took it. And then in February, I think sometime around February of 93, I became the director of the program. It was just kind of a natural pathway to finding more responsibility, looking for more ways to impact not just people we serve, but the people who could help them and the communities that needed to come all in, that were not there, like law enforcement, like prosecution, like housing, like food assistance, all the ways that we can help people get free of the violence. They needed information, they needed resources, they needed to know who they should be asking for advice when they started to develop policy and programs. And so I moved into that realm and found I was fairly decent at it and stayed for over 20 years.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. That is so impressive. And I'm grateful for all the work that you did and continue to do. Rita, tell us about what you're involved in today.
Well, somewhere along the way, Dave, it became really clear to us that mostly women who did this work, we were never going to stop this violence by ourselves, that we needed men. We needed good men to help us. And this was after the Nicole Brown Simpson, Ron Goldman murder. That really was the trial of the century at that point in time in 1994. It was a horrendous thing that happened. And it clearly so badly was responded to and mishandled by the people in Los Angeles. And so Nicole never should have died. So I started thinking about how do we engage men, good men who are not violent, because the reality is that most men are not. Up until that point, men are very silent. They don't help. They don't assist. For whatever reason, they don't engage with us. And I was trying to figure out ways that we needed good men to be talking to men, to say, this is not appropriate behavior. You need to stop. My feeling was that women could talk to them all day, and we were never going to have the impact we needed. So in 1998, I reached out to the National Football League because I didn't know who could talk to men better than the NFL. And so I sent a letter to them asking them if there was a way we could work together. And somebody was coming out to a Denver Broncos game from the headquarters in New York. And he met with one of my board members and I actually said to him, you know, what we know now about the NFL is that you spend all your time and energy cleaning up messes from bad behavior. That's what we hear. We hear the negative. We hear the DUIs. We hear the sexual assault, the domestic violence. That's what we hear. I said, that's not most of the players. That's not most of the people associated. How do we get those men to talk? Those men need to be the story because we need men speaking up. And so he listened. I never came at them from a you ought to and you owe us. All men are bad. It was not that framework. It was, there are good men here. I need good men.
Yeah.
How do I get good men? And so he listened, he was kind, but I think 1998, I don't think the National Football League could figure out how to make any of this work. From 1998 until 2014, every time I had an opportunity, Dave, I just kept poking them. When there was a high-profile case, I would just keep poking them and saying, how can we help? How can we help?
Yeah.
We could really do good things together. And so when I got their attention big time was around fall of 2012. Javon Belcher killed Cassandra Perkins and then went to Arrowhead Stadium and committed suicide in front of some of his coaches.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and it was horrific. It really impacted Kansas City. It impacted the whole NFL family. And at that point in time, I had met a man named Don McPherson who does really great anti-violence work now, but was a former NFL quarterback that played for the Philadelphia Eagles. And Don's a really good guy. And I'd met Don. And so I connected with Don. I said, Don, can we co-write a letter to Roger Goodell? Will you do that with me? Can we get their attention for a minute after this murder suicide? And so we wrote a letter together. He and I were invited to NFL headquarters in New York to talk to them. And so at that point, the way I engaged with them was to say, this is probably happening in all 32 of your cities where you have teams, probably happening within your NFL non-football family administration, whether it's NFL Films or NFL Network. It's happening because you employ a lot of people. So let me give you the resources for where things are located in the cities where you have teams, so that if this comes up again for them, they know who to reach out to. They know who their DV or sexual assault person is, who are the people that they can get for resources and services. So I started working kind of an internally process with them. And that from February of 2013, which is when I first met with them, to July of 2014, I was doing that kind of work internally with them at the NFL. I left NCADV in July of 2014, and in August of 2014, the more complete video of the Ray Rice assault on Janae went public. And the NFL, because it had previously, it only had a kind of a short clip of the assault, and it wasn't the inside the elevator attack. It was just him pulling her out of the elevator.
Right.
That's all we had seen. And so everybody saw what the level of that violence was. And the commissioner had given him a 2-game suspension because what he'd heard and what he'd seen wasn't as bad as what was real. So the NFL just got hammered for inappropriate response. And
yeah.
And that's when they decided maybe we need help. And so they started doing a whole lot. They interviewed a whole lot of people. They hired 5 experts to help them develop a plan, a strategy, respond to these issues, provide education. And I became one of those senior advisors for the National Football League on domestic violence and sexual assault. And I've been working with them now for nearly 10 years.
Rita, that is so impressive. And I am so grateful that you are doing that. I think it's having an impact on much more than just the NFL. Do you also feel that? Do you sense that not only you, but your coworkers, your colleagues are having an impact nationally at a larger reach than just the NFL?
The commissioner did the interviews personally. I mean, he called me and we had a conversation when he was trying to decide who he wanted to bring in. And we had a fairly honest conversation. And my response to him was, Commissioner, if you want to donate some money and do a couple PSAs, and that's your response, I'm not interested in that. What I'm interested in is the fact that you have the ability to change this culture. You have a reach and you impact mostly men in ways that we could never do that from this work. And so if you are interested, you can make an impact that will be life-changing. And if that's what you're willing to do, if the level of change you're interested in is that, I'm in. I talked to him about the fact that he already had in place some strategies and platforms that they could already utilize or expand on. They already do training. Training is one of the things they do a lot of at the NFL. And it's not just physical training, but they teach them. And they have rookie classes where they teach people about, now you've got a lot of money and you need to use it well. They just had an infrastructure that was just so full and rich. And they had this Play 60 platform where they engage kids for physical activity. And so all the teams do community connections to kids around physical health. And so I said, you could expand on that. And when they're doing the Play 60, they just do a segment on respect for self and others. And you start to get down into Pop Warner football. And I said, if that's what you're interested in, you want to do that kind of reach, you have the capacity to do that. And it's not going to be a big lift. So that was what I was interested in, because he said, that's what I'm looking for. And I said, okay, I'm in. I'm with you. I want to do that because I think we can change things here. And then they picked a national domestic violence partner and a national sexual assault partner, and they did massive multi-year funding with them. And they have been really integral in helping us as we do the advising within the league to make sure we're on track and we're doing this according to how it's helpful to the field. And so there's been just a huge change in impact. We have done an original education session every year for the league, for everyone associated with the league. So from owners to groundskeepers, everyone, it's mandatory. They have to sit through or watch this session. And so every year they've gotten a little bit more information about domestic violence and sexual assault. And so they're getting much more educated about what are the resources, what's the impact, how do you help people that you know in your family, and what can the NFL do to change this dynamic within the community that you work and live in. I think, yes, it's starting to move past because they have such a great connection to college coaches and high school coaches. And so they're just pushing this information out in ways that we in this field could never reach. That first year, Dave, with those series of PSAs, the No More PSAs that were so impactful, from the first of the season through every game through the Super Bowl, those PSAs had a reach of over 1 billion media impressions.
Wow.
We would have never had that kind of reach in this field. As good as we are and as smart as we are, as engaging as we are, we could have never had that kind of an impact. And so that first year alone, it just kind of blew open the opportunity for people to understand more about this issue. How do you get services and how I can help? Those were the things that I had always envisioned might be possible with an entity that had that kind of influence and platform. And we're just lucky that someone was leading at the time in Commissioner Goodell that he was willing to take the risk and go in.
That's impressive. I'm going to turn this to a personal note and ask you, do you actually realize, Rita, a sense of accomplishment and pride in what you've done and what your team has done in having the impact that you've had and continue to have? Because if you don't, I'm going to sit here all the rest of this afternoon and tonight and toot your horn. I mean, this is amazing accomplishment.
Well, yeah, Dave, I do think I understand what we've been able to do. And I think that this field, particularly trying to end violence against women, we have been really willing to be as creative as possible around how do we change this? Because for the reality is our lives depend on it, right? The people who do this work, the people who, many of who are survivors, who managed to get out and came back to help. It was really about not thinking within a box about how do we do this? Who do we talk to? How do we talk to people to help them understand that everybody has a role to play here? It can be a big role or it can be a small role, but everybody has a role to play. And if everybody works together, everybody in concert works together, then we can fix this. We can make this better. We can reduce the harm that's being done. And then we're all safer. Because I think once I started to understand what people were telling me about the impact of the violence on their lives, I understood the tangential ways in which that violence does not end in the home. It's not a private individual process. It impacts us in our workplace. It impacts us in our faith communities. It impacts us at schools where kids go who have just spent the whole night terrified that their mom is going to die. Everywhere we go, that violence seeps into our community. And people don't understand that the kind of violence that's being perpetrated against someone says they love is a danger to all of us, because terrorists and mass murderers, mass shooters, the one thing the significant number of them have in common is they have a history of violence against women. And so if we want to be safe in our communities, then we need to hold those people accountable before they reach a lethal stage, because that makes me safer when I go to the grocery store. Right. And that's the thing that I think that we're starting to get across to people, is that it's not just about that family 2 doors down that you hear yelling all the time. What that impact has outside the home really makes a difference to my safety.
That is so true and so important. I don't think it could be articulated any better than what you just did. I am wondering, as I sit here listening to you, what can this podcast do besides airing this episode to further that mission? Obviously, this podcast is called Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, but it doesn't just involve sexual assault and rape, especially where interpersonal violence is concerned and domestic violence. Because what people don't realize is that if there is domestic violence in the home, the probability that there is also rape and sexual assault within that relationship is greater than 90%. And so my message to everyone is that we all need to do our part to bring justice to victims and survivors of not just rape and sexual assault, but interpersonal violence, domestic violence. So that is my goal, because we all know someone who is a victim or survivor of rape or sexual assault or interpersonal violence. In that light, what's your message to my audience in terms of helping to bring justice to victims and survivors?
Well, I think the thing that's most important to me is that people be willing to just listen, to learn. What you think you know about this kind of trauma isn't accurate. There's just no way to know how this is going to impact a human being. So people who think, well, that would never happen to me because I don't do X, Y, or Z, it's just not true. We have no control over that. There are people who want to hurt us, people who are very good at convincing us that they will not hurt us, and then are an enormous danger to us. And so I think that it's important for people, because there are probably family members, there are probably friends, there are probably coworkers or someone in their faith community who might need someone to listen to them. And there are lots of really good information and resources now available where people can learn how to be a listener and a good support, and get, at a minimum, can find out where your local domestic violence and sexual assault service is, have the information about how you help someone who might talk to you about that. Learn some of the warning signs, because maybe what you can do is reach out to somebody and say, you know, it feels like there may be some things going on in your relationship that aren't okay. And I just wanted to let you know that I know where you could get some help and advice if you ever feel a need. You know, it's just engaging people in a conversation if you start to have concerns about what may be happening to them. For me, it's that great slogan that Violence Against Women International created, which is, you just start by believing.
Yep.
You start there. You just start by believing what you're being told. And then you do the investigate and confirm. But you don't start out questioning what you're being told. You just listen, you accept that that's happening, and then you confirm, you validate later in some fashion. That first step to just opening your mind and your heart to knowing that this person is telling you something that's probably the worst thing that's ever happened to them, and you just accept it for what it is. And then if there's another way to understand it or reframe it, then that happens later, not the first time somebody engages you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that those are really easy kind of steps that one can take. Just find out where the resources are, be willing to listen without judgment, and say, how can I help you? Thank you for sharing that. How can I help you? You don't have to do this alone. It's really simple to just do that much, and that's going to make a difference.
That is so spot on. It's part of my message every week, is to start by believing. I say that at the end of every episode. And so I'm glad you emphasized that, because it's such a big part of what this podcast and this mission is all about. The awareness, the education, and then the whole concept of taking that trauma-informed approach of being empathic and understanding and compassionate and doing exactly what you said. What can I do to help? And also, I would like to ask if there's a possibility of maybe having you come back for another episode sometime to let us know what's going on in this realm, not only with the NFL, but with what your individual efforts are doing and what your impact and hopes are for what the future holds.
I'd be happy to come back, Dave.
Thank you so much. Rita, this has been a true pleasure for me. Thank you again so much for being with me today.
You're welcome.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I want to offer my deepest thanks to Rita Smith for sharing her time, her wisdom, and her decades of hard-fought experience with all of us. Conversations like this remind me why this work matters, because when leaders like Rita show up with clarity and courage, it helps every survivor feel a little more seen, a little more understood, and a lot less alone. Rita, thank you for your lifetime of advocacy, for the systems you've changed, and for the survivors whose lives you've touched without ever seeking credit. It's an honor to have your voice here on the SAS podcast. And for all of you listening right now, thank you for being here and for being a part of SAS. Thank you for listening with compassion and curiosity, and for staying committed to understanding the real impact of trauma on the lives of victims and survivors. This is why the SAS podcast exists. To normalize the conversation, to educate, and to hold space for these stories so they can lead to justice, understanding, and change. If this episode spoke to you, share it with someone who needs it. Keep the conversation going in your circles your communities, and your workplaces. And as always, start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.